Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Robert Coons, and this is Qigong Project. Today we're going to talk about Daoist Qigong. What is it? How should we understand it? What's involved? And how is it different from other styles of Qigong? I already recorded this video once before, but there was construction equipment outside my house, so we're doing it a second time to give you better quality. Okay, so Daoist Qigong is a subset of Qigong practice. It usually involves all the same things that normal Qigong styles involve, like breathing exercises, intention or visualization exercises, movement exercises, etc., etc. Right? All Qigong systems are basically formed by a combination of those aforementioned things, but it has a special Daoist flavor. So it's interesting to talk about how Daoist practice differs from regular Qigong practice, but before we do that, we have to understand a little bit about the foundations of what makes it Daoist. And so I'll spend the first part of the video getting into that idea, and then afterward, we'll talk a little bit more about technical information and comparison. So the very, very first thing that we need to understand is, what is Daoism, and how does it relate to Qigong? And this is a really difficult question to answer, actually, because Daoism can mean a lot of things to different people. But broadly speaking, I think if we're being completely fair, Daoism is a school of thought which emerged first as a philosophy, and there have been a number of different philosophical variations of Daoism over the years, and then eventually became a religion. Within the religion of Daoism, there are contained various types of practices which emphasize the energetics and the spirit of the human body, so qi and spirit. Having said that, when we talk about Daoist Qigong, we're not usually talking about religious practice per se, but instead we're talking about energetic practices outside of the Daoist religion. This can be a little bit confusing, especially due to the fact that there's no complete consensus among scholars in the West about precisely what defines Daoism or how we should understand its practices. So we have to do a little bit of explaining here before we can go on to the next step. When people think of energetic practices in China, they usually think of Daoism. This is because the Daoist religion acts as a repository for many, many different types of practices. The Daoist religion has one of the largest collections of sacred documents in the world. It's called Daozang, or the Daoist canon. And within the Daoist canon, there are many, many types of exercises that today we would recognize as Qigong. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that all schools of Daoism practice all of the techniques. And it also doesn't mean that the techniques came from those schools of Daoism. What I mean here, and what I can now explain a little more clearly, is that there was a time period of about 700 years between when the first Daoist philosophical tracts were written, around 2,500 years ago, and when Daoism started to really prominently become a religion, around, let's say 1,800 years ago, give or take. That Daoism primarily expressed itself as a philosophical school of thought and was primarily practiced by the, let's say, aristocratic class in China. And during that time is when the first proliferation of practices that we would recognize as being similar to Qigong began to appear in China. So the earliest recorded breathwork document is called the Xingqiming. Xingqiming means the stele or the inscription of, let's say, activating the breath. And that document was carved on, I believe, a jade tablet sometime around 2,300 years ago. It's a very, very old document. And it basically teaches deep breathing practices in order to get the qi of the body to circulate better so that people can, quote unquote, connect heaven and earth. The idea being that the body has an earth area, which is the abdomen, and then the sky outside of the body is the heavens. And so when people breathe in and they do these certain breathing techniques, then they're getting the heavens to connect with the earth in their body, and they're harmonizing humanity, heaven, and earth, which is a very important idea in Chinese philosophy. After that, the second oldest set of documents that we know about come from a funerary complex excavation, which is called the Ma Wang Dui Funerary Complex. And in this excavation, many, many different documents of Chinese literature were discovered, which date back perhaps as far as 2,200 years, but perhaps even longer. And they were owned by a member of the Han Dynasty elite who happened to live in the area where ultimately his family was buried. And those documents included things like the Dao De Jing, various Chinese medicine documents, documents about astronomy, and documents about also, of course, Daoyin and Tuna. So Daoyin meaning like stretching practices, basically, and Tuna meaning breathing practices, basically. And so along with those documents, the included were the Daoyin Tu, right? So the pictorial explanation of Daoyin, which has many different images of people doing various leading and stretching exercises, as well as a text called Abstaining from Grains and Eating the Breath, which is an early document about how you can do deep breathing practices during fasting in order to get more qi in your body. And so you should consider, are these documents inherently Daoist, or are they just part of Han Dynasty dynastic culture? And I think even though we often tend to say that these energetic exercises are the domain of Daoism, it's probably more right to say that Daoism has historically served as a container for those exercises, and that the exercises can be more broadly considered to be part of the Chinese cultural system. Since exercises like that appear in many places, not just in the context of Daoism. For instance, as mentioned here, during the Han Dynasty, many of the people in the dynastic elite were practicing these exercises. So that's our first bit of information about this connection between these exercises and Daoism. A little later on in history, it becomes more confusing. And so you start to have both religious Daoists under the Tianshi sect of Daoism originally, and then later under different sects. And then you also have literati figures who started their own philosophy school called the Xuan Shui, or Mystery Study School, which was broadly based on the teachings of Lao Tzu, even though it also did include certain Confucian and other teachings as well. And indeed, it is the Mystery Study School who are the first to put a document out called Yang Sheng, the discussion of nurturing life. So Yang Sheng, this topic, in Daoist practice, so, if we say Daoism in a general way, is a very, very important topic. And it's the thing that describes these sort of proto-Qigong exercises, as well as things like dietary knowledge and, knowledge about what to do at different times of year and different times of day and so on, right? These things emerged from within the Xuan Shui, the Mystery Study School. Specifically, the author of that text was named Qikang. And so you can say in a certain way that this is Daoist because it's consistent and based on the philosophy of Lao Tzu. But then at the same time, it's also not the same as the Daoist religion, really. So again, one more example here. During this early period of the formation of so-called Daoist Qigong, there were a couple of other major thinkers. One name is Ge Hong. So Ge Hong was a very famous literati figure who practiced many kind of life-extending exercises, as well as practicing external alchemy. And he left a book behind called Bao Puzi, Master of Embracing Simplicity. And again, he illustrates many types of practices which are really directly associated with the Tao. But as far as I know, Ge Hong himself was not a Daoist priest. He may have followed Daoist priests, or he may have been influenced by Daoist priests, but he was again a member of this aristocracy who were like a kind of landed literate class. And so for the first 1,000 years or so of the history of Daoism, a lot of this knowledge, which we think of as very deeply ingrained into Daoism, was passed down by maybe about 10 famous Chinese families, including the Guo family, including the Wang family, right, including the Sima family, right, one of those rare families with two names in their surname. And over time, this gradually started to meld together with religious orders of Daoism. So just as an example, right, the very famous Wei Hua Cun was one of these foundational figures in Daoist internal practice, and she was a member of a very popular government family, right? So, and I forgot to mention, right, she founded the Shangqing school of Daoism, which was one of the major religious movements of Daoism. Or later you see Sima Chengzhen, right, who is the sixth patriarch of the Shangqing school. Well, he's the descendant of Sima Qian, who was the court librarian, who was the first person to write a biography of Lao Tzu, right? So you can see that the very small handful of families were passing down Daoist knowledge, whether it was literary knowledge or whether it was practical knowledge, and eventually they integrated together with the Daoist religion in various different ways. So this is kind of how that came to be. And I think in a sense, this is how these life vitality exercises came to be associated with Daoism. So we can kind of define them in that way. They're things that exist within Daoism because they're passed down inside of the Daoist canon. And at the same time, they're things which exist in the commons as well because they're also, passed down to people who are, not so directly associated with the movers and shakers in the Daoist world, right? And, just as an example, in modern times, there's plenty of Chinese families that have yangsheng systems. There's plenty of families who have, internal cultivation systems. And the people, they may or may not choose to practice them in future generations. But notwithstanding that, right, there's still plenty of people who practice these things, and they're not out there trying to market themselves, right? It's just things that their families do that they've passed down over generations. I know people who just have very small little family yangsheng systems, and sometimes when they learn new useful exercises, they even put them into the system, right? It's just what it is. So there's that. Now, I'm not going to give you a whole history of Daoism here. That would be too much. But what I'd like to do next is to talk about where Daoism interfaces with Qigong. Now, by now you might have said, well, hey, but Rob, you already explained it, right? Daoism practices these things like breath work and some physical exercises and some meditation and visualization, and that's how it should. That's Qigong, right? Well, not exactly. And so this is where things get a little bit difficult. This phrase Qigong has only been in circulation. It's been in circulation for less than a century. Initially, it began to be used in the 1950s to describe a type of practice that was, exercise for longevity. And I've mentioned this in another video in the past, but the first person who was the primary, let's say, founder of Qigong, his name was Liu Guizhen. And he was a member of the Chinese Communist Party who had, I believe he had tuberculosis. And he was very sick, so he was allowed to go home to his home village. And it was sort of presumed that he would die. But as it turned out, he had an uncle who was a practitioner of Buddhist longevity practices who helped nurse him back to health by teaching him these practices. And so he, upon returning to the party, was able to introduce those practices to the members of the party, and they thought that it was impressive enough that they put together a committee to develop this thing, which would be called Qigong. And it wasn't a committee just of people who did Daoist or Buddhist practice or Chinese medicine practice or martial arts, right? A lot of different people got to participate and put in their 2 cents. And so what came to be known as Qigong is really a synthesis and various different approaches to synthesizing multiple different genres of practice. So any popular modern Qigong system you see will be composed of component parts that come from all the different, medieval schools of thought, which are not called Qigong, right? They're called different things like Tuna, Daoyin, Cunxiang, Neigong. The list goes on. And so this, it's quite important to understand that Qigong is a decidedly modern phenomenon. And when we use the word Qigong to describe a Daoist practice, this is a modern application of Daoism. It's not the word traditional is always a kind of strange word, right? Maybe it's better to say it's not a medieval approach to Daoism, but things change over the years. And so some Daoists are quite happy to have Daoist Qigong, right? Daoist Qigong at Wudang, the Mount Wudang area, right? These different mountains that make up Wudang, they're completely happy to practice Daoist Qigong. And those Qigong methods tend to be a combination of both their traditional stuff and more modern stuff, right? It's not completely, let's say, the most authentic Daoist in nature material, but at the same time, it incorporates their material. And that's done in order to promote Daoism, right? It's a good way to get people's feet in the door. So when we say Daoist Qigong, we have to still define what it means. And when I was thinking about making this video, I came up with a couple of definitions. So, here's the thing, right? If you read Qigong books in the English language, I'm sure that occasionally you'll find excellent books that cover a whole range of different ideas. One very, very good book published in 1997 was Yang Jungming's The Root of Chinese Qigong. And I say it's a good book because it's one of the first books to take an overview of Qigong practice rather than just introducing a method. And so he talks a little bit about Daoist Qigong, Buddhist Qigong, Confucian Qigong, etc. And he lays down at least a reasonable view of it that can help us to jump off and go into the topic a little bit more deeply. If you were to read Chinese medicine Qigong textbooks, well, let me see. I have one right here on my bookshelf. So this book, 中医气功学, so the study of Chinese medicine Qigong, it lays down the basics of what each of the different schools of Qigong have in them, right? Because Chinese medicine Qigong itself is not it's not a style, right? It's a systematic way of viewing practice that can help us to understand many different styles of Qigong from the medical perspective. So Daoist Qigong is one of them. And basically what it says is Daoist Qigong is a method that incorporates those things that I already mentioned, right? Breathing exercises, some movement stuff, meditation practices, and visualization and these things. But it does so from the Daoist perspective. So that gives us one vantage point from which to view Daoist Qigong, right? We can understand it in a very general way if we just say it's those Qigong exercises, but done in a way which conforms to the principles of Daoism, which means that it's soft, gentle, emphasizes non-action, emphasizes tranquility, relatively more stillness, and relatively less activity. The movement of energy comes from stillness of the body and mind, etc., right? So that's okay. That's one way to define things. Another way to define things is a little bit more abrasive, and some academics in the West takes this approach. They would say Daoist Qigong really isn't a thing. And the reason why it really isn't a thing is because Daoism is its own organic tradition, and Qigong is separate from Daoism, right? Qigong wasn't created by Daoists. Well, it was in a sense, actually, but we can get to that. Qigong was created by a government committee, and any kind of attempt to make Daoism fit into Qigong is a kind of cynical government plot to take away the religious and spiritual values of Daoism. Now, I don't think there's too much merit to that concept, to be honest. I think that concept is a little bit snotty, and I think it underestimates the desire of many groups of people to cooperate under the early stages of Chinese communism. I'm not here to talk about the benefits of different forms of government, but I just want to say that it's better to take the perspective that when people were cooperating, including Daoists, Chinese medicine people, martial artists, etc., to create Qigong, it wasn't under duress. It was an especially privileged and good position to be in, and anybody who was doing it were doing it because they wanted to be there doing it. Right? It was to improve society because everybody came together under the utopian vision that they wanted to make society a better place. And that's just like the same thing that we would do if we wanted to make society a better place. We would form groups of people to make think tanks to help do it, right? So, different types of government aside, I'm not making any kind of qualitative comment about the values of any particular system, but I just want to mention that those Daoist figures that were cooperating to make Qigong were not doing so cynically. They weren't doing so under duress. They were doing so because they wanted to. So I think that second view is a little bit mistaken, but there's still something we can take from it. And I think what we can take from it is the important idea that whatever Qigong is, it encapsulates an approach to Daoism when we call it Daoist Qigong, or when we faithfully use Daoist methods to practice Qigong. And the especially important thing about that idea is that what Qigong does is it creates a uncompromisingly secular approach to practice. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation, but the term secular does not mean atheist, right? And so throughout most of Chinese history, there were people who practiced Daoist practice in the secular realm. Now, a couple years ago, I would have called them secular Daoists, but I think that it's better to say that they were people who appreciate Daoism, like Daoism, and study Daoism, who were living in the secular world. And that doesn't mean that they didn't believe in Daoist deities, but it doesn't mean that they believed in Daoist deities, if you understand what I mean. So some very famous medieval secular figures in the Daoist world, Lu Xixing, the founder of the Eastern School of Internal Alchemy, Li Hanshu, the founder of the Western School of Internal Alchemy, right? Both of these figures, totally secular. Doesn't mean they didn't have temple affiliations, but they were not members of the Daoist clergy. And so when I say secular from the medieval perspective, I mean that whatever their relationship was with the Daoist religion, it didn't deeply impact their writings about meditation. You don't see that much Daoist religion inside of the majority of internal alchemy documents. There are some religiously oriented internal alchemy documents, but that's a different genre. So, on the other hand, in terms of Qigong, the word secular does have a bit of a hard stop, right? Because one of the major features of the CCP is that it's atheist. Now, I think you have to understand that atheism in the CCP doesn't always really mean atheism, right? A lot of CCP members are Buddhist, actually, and a lot of CCP members do things like looking at astrology, just as an example, right? So, like Mao Zedong, for instance, apparently was superstitious in various different ways, right? So you shouldn't take it as Richard Dawkins style atheism, right? It's probably better to understand it as really making a concrete separation between civic society and religion. And in that sense, Qigong, in its mainstream sense, doesn't have any religious qualities to it at all. Which means that if you take Daoist practice, Daoist visualization or breath work or whatever, and you insert it into Qigong, then one of the sort of essential characteristics of that, at least, let's say outside of the world of Daoist temples, is that the Qigong system no longer has a religious quality or a religious flair, and so you can practice it without having to be associated with the Daoist religion in any way. Now, I just want to say again that there have been plenty of people over the years who are not deeply associated with the Taoist religion who practice these things. But Qigong kind of puts it more up front, right? So just as an example, when the complete reality sect, especially the Dragon Gate school, came to be dominant in China, they were charged with the task of promoting Taoist practice in China, which means that the majority of the internal alchemy schools that came about after the Dragon Gate sect or the Dragon Gate school was made the leader of complete reality school Daoism in China were deeply influenced by the Dragon Gate school. And so what I'm trying to say is, if you wanted to learn internal alchemy, then you would go to a Daoist priest that you could be introduced to who knew how to practice internal alchemy. So even if you're a secular person, even if you don't believe in Daoism, well, you're probably dealing with Daoist priests in some capacity if you want to study these arts. And that's just the way it is, just the way it was, right? Now it's a little bit different, but I'd say broadly speaking that it's pretty similar. You know, basically you want to learn these Daoist practices, who better to talk to than the Daoists, right? But Daoist Qigong is a different thing, because it's maybe people with some relationship with Daoism, but they especially focus on Daoist documents to derive their knowledge. And so this is another sort of third definition of Daoist Qigong, where we can escape the limitations of the other two definitions, right? We can understand Daoist Qigong methods through reading the documents of the genre. Now, you know, unfortunately, there's no big pile of books with the name Daoist Qigong on them from the ancient times where we can get everything in one stop. You have to be a little bit savvy, and you have to know what to read. And sometimes it's not entirely clear where Chinese medicine ends and Daoism starts, or, you know, where Daoism and Buddhism are perfectly separated, right? So it's not like it's completely easy to separate all the documents into perfectly neat categories. But broadly speaking, you know, there's a way of doing life-nourishing practices, which is Daoism, which is Daoist, and many of the texts are collected in convenient places, like the Small Daoist Canon, for instance, also called Yunji Qiqian. It has many traditional Daoist breathwork practices and many visualization practices, right? The Internal Alchemy School has its entire own genre of meditation books. I don't really believe that Internal Alchemy is Qigong, but that's for another video. And so on and so forth, right? There's some very famous authors like Sun Si Miao, Ge Hong, right? So you would know to look for those people. And then what you start seeing when you compare their practices is that they all have some things in common, right? They tend to use the theory of the three dantians. They tend to use the theory of original qi, original essence, and original spirit. They tend to, you know, sort of use the idea that the energy enters into a state of not moving, and then that causes it to move, right? Or, you know, they tend to focus on body, you know, different parts of the internal body, et cetera, right? Different visualizations that are Taoist in nature. And so that's how you find out they're Taoist. Whereas, you know, Buddhist documents will do the same thing, but using Buddhist ideas. And that's essentially, you know, to my mind, what separates Daoist Qigong from other forms of Qigong, is that when you read the documents, they tend to have a particular flavor that's specific to Taoism. So that's probably the easiest way to analyze that particular idea. And so now that we have a reasonable working analysis of what Daoist Qigong is, we can move on to the next step, which is to compare it against other systems. So I think that I'm not going to compare Daoist Qigong to Buddhist Qigong today. Buddhist Qigong is too big in a sense. We could compare it to parts of Buddhist Qigong, but the problem is sometimes there's an issue of who gets to define these things. And in my opinion, both Daoist Qigong and Buddhist Qigong suffer from the current problem of being defined by people who are outside of the traditions. So as an example, right, that handy-dandy Chinese medicine textbook that I showed you, it has quite a detailed section on Buddhist Qigong. And it makes the point that Vajrayana Buddhism from Tibet is a kind of Buddhist Qigong. But you know, if you were to talk to Vajrayana people who are students of Tibetan Buddhism, I think that they would strongly disagree with that, because what they do, they don't view as Qigong, just like a lot of Taoists don't view their methods as Qigong. And so the problem comes from being defined from outside of the genre. But we can look at Daoist Qigong relative to let's say, Chinese medicine Qigong. So Chinese medicine Qigong could use any Taoist, Buddhist, or other technique, but its main purpose is to, along with diagnosis of a patient's illness, prescribe the appropriate Qigong method, right? So that's the foundational crux of Chinese medicine Qigong. So that's how you would practice it, other than just doing, regular sort of upkeep stuff. And for the upkeep stuff, you could choose any kind of Qigong techniques that you like that help you with the general health issues that you have. But with Daoist Qigong, there's quite a different idea in mind, right? Daoist Qigong is aiming toward longevity and perhaps even some sort of spiritual insight. And so that kind of practice, it has a different flavor, right? You might have to do it more earnestly in a certain sense. It requires you to be more austere. It requires you to have a quiet place to practice. It requires you to do certain types of practices that specifically impact the energy body in a special way, right? That's one possible comparison. Another comparison would be to mainstream Qigong. Like, let's say that we take the 8 silk brocades. So in the 8 silk brocades, there's variations of the practice which are relatively more martial arts orientated, and there's variations of the practice which are relatively more Taoist orientated. And the martial arts orientated one is done standing. It's done with, 8 distinct postures that are based on moving the body and stretching and opening and strengthening in certain ways. Whereas the Taoist orientated practice is done seated with very few movements, maybe only 2 or 3 movements, and the majority of things happening inside the body, like the collection of saliva and swallowing it in a specific way, focusing on the lower dantian, clicking the teeth, beating on the back of the head with the fingers to open up the qi to enter into the head via the spine, etc., right? More sort of internal exercises. So those are more in keeping with Daoism. And you can make the argument there that the standing version of the 8 silk brocades, it actually is a kind of martial arts warm-up exercise. Whereas the seated version, and I don't mean the modern, popularized Qigong seated version, that's totally different. That's just the stand-up version done while sitting down. I mean the real one from the Ming Dynasty. The seated version, it's more about internal energetic circulation, basically. And so again, that kind of typifies Daoist Qigong. So you can get an idea there. Or you could compare it against, let's say, Zhineng Qigong. I practice Zhineng Qigong, so it's one that I like to talk about from time to time. The founder of Zhineng Qigong had a very good understanding of Daoist Qigong. He had a very good understanding of Buddhist Qigong, and he had a very good understanding of Chinese medicine and various other schools. And what he did was sort of melded them together. But the basis of the practice very strongly emphasizes Dao Yin as the main approach. It has stillness exercises too, but Dao Yin is the main approach to practice. And then Pang's major idea was to put together the intention with the body in order to create a synthesis of body and mind. So that's the typifying feature of Zhineng Qigong. Whereas Daoist Qigong, it doesn't explicitly care about body and mind. What it cares about is energy moving in the right way and returning back to stillness. And then the stillness being a way to collect and to generate energy. And then any other kind of things you're doing, like visualization or movements or whatever, they're all used to facilitate that return back to stillness. So it's a very different idea from Zhineng Qigong, which uses stillness to some extent, but not as far, right? And so if you want to define Daoist Qigong, I would say that probably the best way to define it is that the utmost of stillness generates movement, and then movement, when it reaches its extreme, returns back to stillness. And all of those things can be measured through the change and transformation of yin and yang, in the most nascent state where the absolute of non-being generates being, all the way up to all of the changes of the 64 hexagrams, right? And you can use all of those principles to measure it, and it always returns back to one source, which is, basically the Tao. So I think that's a really easy way to understand Daoist Qigong, to differentiate it from other styles, and then to sort of know what to, where to look to find stuff and how to analyze it, right? Is this Daoist? Is it not? I mean, in the end, does it matter too much? I don't know. It depends if you want to study it, right? If it's your dream to practice Daoist Qigong, then you should try to figure out what it is so that you can do it more easily. But if you just want to, improve your health and feel good and have a nice practice, you just do whatever style. It doesn't really matter. They're all good. They just have different strong points and different drawbacks. That's it. So one more thing I would like to say, because there's some people who, because of popular scholarly thought or whatever reason, they've become a little bit radicalized in their position about Daoism. And they have a tendency to say, well, Daoism is a religion. It's always been a religion. There's never really been any sort of separate philosophical Daoism, etc., etc. Therefore, this Daoist Qigong thing is pretty suspect, and we shouldn't take it too seriously. And, or maybe we should even shut down discussion about it, right? There's one very famous essay, I'm not going to say who wrote it, but there was a very famous essay that was put out a number of years ago about what constitutes and what doesn't constitute Daoism. And as far as I can tell, it was just a way to shut down discussion. But, and we've gone into this whole thing about the secular realm and the religious realm, and how during the early days of Daoism, sort of this let's say aristocratic form of Daoism was more popular, and then gradually it became a religion, right? And there's all this sort of, washing back and forth between the commons and the clergy, etc., right? We already covered that earlier in the video. But what we can talk about now is how Qigong ended up having Daoist practice in it, because actually that's pretty straightforward. One of the major Daoist thinkers in modern Qigong was Chen Yingning, who I think I mentioned him earlier in the video. Chen Yingning was part of the committee that created Qigong, and he advocated for a practice called Jingong. Jingong means stillness practice. Incidentally, at my Gumroad, here, shameless plug, at my Gumroad account, I actually have a course about Qigong right now that just came out. So welcome to go check it out if you're interested. It's like only $35. So it's a good way to learn about actually how that part of Qigong came into being. The documents for the book are written by Chen Yingning. Anyway, that's enough advertising. I feel guilty already. But Chen Yingning and his disciple Hu Haiya spent a lot of effort to promote Jingong practice or stillness practice, in which they emphasized seated meditation. So they came up with a couple of methods that they liked. Chen Yingning focused on something called Zhuangzi Zhai Xin Fa. Zhuangzi Zhai Xin Fa means the heart fasting method of Master Zhuangzi. And so basically it's a method where you internally observe your breaths until you become tranquil, and then you forget your breaths and you enter into deep meditation. So that was Chen Yingning's approach to Jingong practice, which ultimately made its way into contemporary Qigong. Hu Haiya's approach was something called Tingfu Fa. Tingfu means listening to the skin, Fa means method. And so in that method, what you do is you imagine the breath is coming and going through the pores of your skin, and then that allows you to get a sort of unification of body and mind together with the breath, and then you enter into deep meditation from there. And both of those methods can help energy be generated in the body. Chen Yingning actually researched the Zhuangzi Zhai Xin Fa when he was when he was living in a hospital toward the end of his life. And he used it as a way to treat the patients there, and had reasonably good success with it. So these are things that are actually concrete ways where you can see that Daoism entered into Qigong culture during the 1950s and 60s. That really happened. And Chen Yingning and Hu Haiya are two of the most respected figures in modern Daoism, right? So Chen Yingning was the co-founder of the China Daoist Research Association, and Hu Haiya served as the treasurer and the resident expert on internal alchemy practice at the Beijing Daoist Research Association, I think all the way up to his death, which was in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And so, these are people who are very credible figures in the Daoist community. As with any community, there's people that like them and there's people that don't like them. But it's impossible to really understate the importance of the work that they did and their impact on modern Daoism. And at the same time, they were very essential to the proliferation of modern Qigong with a Daoist flavor, right? Now, there's other people who have added to the conversation too, right? So it's not just them, but I just wanted to give examples of two very credible figures in Daoism who made major impact on the proliferation and expansion of modern Qigong into what it is today. At the same time, there were also Daoist priests involved in the in the project, right? And so one minorly popular method of practice is called Xiantian Qigong, right? Pre-heaven Qigong. Actually, it's just internal alchemy. It was promoted by a Daoist priest in Shandong province. I can't remember his name now, but lots of people know him if you mention him in the Daoist community. And so it's one of these things where, you can't get any perfect answers that you can put in a box and take them home, and they'll be precise doctrine, and then you'll be able to be happy that you're done knowing about these things, right? Actually, they're sort of partially organized, partially disorganized realities, just like everything else. And because of that, if you want to understand them, then you have to be a little bit tenacious. You have to be a little bit open-minded, and you have to be a little bit hardworking. And then, it's not that hard to understand them. But my reason for making these videos at Qigong Project is that I would really like to disseminate information about Qigong which is accessible and which is at least basically correct, right? So I'm not very self-proud, you know what I mean? Like, I try not to be egotistical, because why would I? I feel like a chubby, guy in my mid-40s. Nothing fancy here. But at the same time, I have knowledge which at least is mostly probably not completely incorrect, and that's better than a lot of stuff. And so I figured, hey, I can make these videos, and maybe they'll do some good for the community. And so I'm going to be here to explain these things more and more in the future, right? I'll do videos about different genres of Qigong. I started mostly with things I know more about, like Daoist Qigong, because I practiced internal alchemy for so many years, or Neigong, because I practiced the internal martial arts for so many years, right? But we'll keep moving on to different stuff, and we'll talk about everything, right? That's the idea of Qigong Project. So I'm really glad that you've chosen to watch until the end of the video. I mean, that's crazy that you listened to me talk for that long. But thank you, and please like the video, and then also, if you're not subscribed, then why not subscribe? And hey, if you're interested in learning a bit more about Qigong or other areas of Qigong, both Daoist and otherwise, I got the link to the Gumroad in the description, so head over there and have a look, and maybe there's something you like. If you want to get in touch, shoot me a comment in the comments section. I read all the comments, and I either like them or answer them depending on the situation. So, you got questions, you got comments, you want to thank me, you want to complain, knock yourself out. Let's be polite and kind to each other, but beyond that, it's pretty open. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. And I'll see you in the next video, whenever that is and whatever it's about.
我喜欢冰淇淋。